Well, I grew up in the same house, lived there until I moved out as an adult, and my parents lived there a little while longer before they moved on to New Orleans East. Uh, the area I grew up in was Gentilly, or considered Gentilly, 7th Ward. It was interesting because I lived on a block with a bunch of relatives. There was our house, there was an aunt and uncle that lived next door to me, another aunt and uncle next door to them, another aunt and uncle next door to them, and then my grandparents lived on the corner. And the reason for that is my grandfather owned the entire block. At one time that was his farm. And he would grow vegetables and sell them in the French Quarter, at the French Market. And when, as his children, he had, let's see, he had eight kids, 3 girls and 5 boys. And as his kids grew up, he gave them each a lot to build their house on. And the interesting thing about the house I grew up in, it was a wood frame house that my father built probably in the, after the war, after he came back from the war, the mid to late 40s. Built it as a 1-bedroom house. Then after the war, when they started decommissioning army posts, he bought a building, I'm not sure whether it was a barracks building or what it was, from Camp Shelby, Mississippi, had it shipped down and attached it to the original house to expand it, creating 2 more bedrooms and another bath, and my sister and I's bedroom was in that part of the house. It was one year during the winter, and we would have freezes periodically, not a lot, just kind of like what you had today in the New Orleans area. But when we'd have freezes, a lot of the houses were raised and the pipes were under the houses and unprotected. So what people would do is they'd leave a little water dripping on a faucet, so the water would keep running, so pipes wouldn't freeze. And I got up in the middle of the night, went to the bathroom, and then turned the water off. And when I got up the next morning, my parents were sitting there and listening to the pipe pop under the house. So all of our pipes froze. We were without water for a week. We would carry water from my uncle's house next door, and my father made me crawl under the house with him during the winter and change all the pipes. And he did that all himself. He had a brother who was a plumber, but he was too busy to really help, but he provided some of the tools that we used to tread the pipe and all that. But I remember crawling under the house and changing the pipes. My great-grandfather, I guess, was the first to come over. His family came over from Germany. There might have been other family members here before, but New Orleans was kind of a place where people ended up. We had, New Orleans had a large Italian population, had a large Irish population, and had a large German population. There were a couple places. I remember an old German Catholic church in the Faubourg Barony area. It may still be there. That was, primarily attended by Germans, and they spoke German at the church. It was a Catholic church, so I didn't go there. I wasn't Catholic, but my father had grown up Catholic. But I think that New Orleans was an international city. It was a place that people knew about, and that's where a lot of Europeans came when they immigrated to this country. And my grandfather was a Stoltz. My grandmother was a Geisler, which was another family that's, German as well, in there. So that's just where they ended up. It's unfortunate that, the Katrina took away a lot of things, and my father had a box of pictures on the floor of his closet. I remember as a child, my parents would have friends and family come over on a Friday night or a Saturday night, and they would play canasta. And about 8 or 9 o'clock, they would take a break, and we'd go get po' boys, usually at Wallace and Raoul's. Another area they would go to get po' boys would be Martin Brothers up on St. Claude Avenue. So that was always fun to, eat po' boys. They'd come back and they'd cut them up, and everybody would eat, and then they'd go back to playing cards. I went to John McDonough Senior High School up on Esplanade Avenue. And every year, if you think about all of the schools that are named McDonough in New Orleans, and there were more than there are today, because a lot of those names changed back in the 70s and 80s. People claimed, McDonough was a slave owner, and there was a large black population in the city who were in those schools, and they didn't want the names, so they changed. But there would be what we would call Founders Day every year, and all the students would get bused up to City Hall. There was a statue up there to John McDonough, because he pretty much built the New Orleans public school system. He donated the money for all the schools, most of the schools that he built in the city. And so they would have a Founders Day, and all the kids would dress up, and they would go up there, and they would lay flowers at the statue of John McDonough. So that was something that was kind of distinct in New Orleans, I guess, because he was the one who donated the money upon his death to build the school. So they made a lot different. We were in a city. Now, we were probably considered the suburbs of New Orleans. We weren't in the downtown area in the French Quarter or the Faubourg Marigny. We were farther out in Gentilly, which was a suburb, and then you had other suburbs, Gentilly Terrace and the Franklin Avenue area, and then you had areas that got built during, I guess, my childhood, Gentilly Woods, and then Pontchartrain Park, which is behind that, which was kind of the first black subdivision in the city for black middle class population, and then it expanded out to New Orleans East. In New Orleans East, when I was a child, it was like, I guess, Highway 90, Chef Mentor Highway went through there. But after you crossed the Industrial Canal and went just, I guess, a mile or so past that, there was nothing. It was all swampland. That's what New Orleans East was. That was what was all around New Orleans. And that gradually started building up after the war, and then the 50s and 60s. And I remember New Orleans East, the last, going out to visit my aunt and uncle who built the house in New Orleans East, and theirs was like, the street ended just one block beyond them, and they were just one block past Reed Boulevard in New Orleans East. So think about how much has been built since then off of Pressburg that runs out that way, and then all the other New Orleans East areas along the I-10. But all you had going out there was the main road was Chef Mentor Highway, and I think it probably should have been the Veterans Highway of New Orleans, and it never really developed that way. It did. You had some shopping centers in there. Swagman's built the largest grocery store in the world out there on Chef Mentor Highway, just before the Industrial Canal, and you had a Sears out there, and I remember Woolco as a kid out there. But we grew up, we considered ourselves in town. We got bus service. My kids started out, I guess, in New Orleans East. They were born there, and then we moved to Slidell. After that, where a lot of people from New Orleans moved eventually to the North Shore, Slidell and Mandeville area. So my kids kind of grew up here in Slidell, which was different. It wasn't a city, it was a smaller town. You didn't have transit authority, you didn't have bus transportation that would take you everywhere, but in those times people considered it safer and wanted their kids to grow up in a safer community than New Orleans was considered at the time. I think the biggest one, when you think of New Orleans, you think about Mardi Gras. And as a young child, I remember going up on St. Charles Avenue. And St. Charles Avenue was kind of the place where families went. And they would set up on the neutral ground. And neutral ground, by the way, is a New Orleans tradition, so to speak. But they would set up on the neutral ground, and you would barbecue out there, and you'd have food. And you would wander wherever you wanted to go. And I'm talking when you were 8, 9, 10 years old, 11 years old, because it was all families around it. And so that was the treat. And then the parades would come, and you'd be there all day. You'd be there for Rex in the morning. Usually we were farther up St. Charles Avenue from where Zulu came. Zulu came out of St. Charles and Jackson, and we were farther up, so we would catch Rex. We would catch all the trucks behind, and there'd be you'd be hoping every year there'd be 200 trucks. And another tradition that we had, that my family had, is every year we would have kind of a family reunion at Pontchartrain Beach. Pontchartrain Beach was at the lake where Elysian Fields comes in. It was an amusement park. They had a large covered area with picnic tables where families would go, and so we would all go out there once a year and have a picnic table, we'd bring food and everything for that, and the kids would take off and go on the rides and then come back there and eat, and then you go swim in the swimming pool or you go swimming in the lake, you know, whatever you wanted to do. And parents didn't worry about following the kids around because it was safe. You know, they could go run around, and they would only get on certain rides that they were old enough to ride. I remember I wanted to ride the Zephyr so bad, but I was always scared to, and finally, you know, got older, and then when you were with other kids, they would say, "Oh, if you go, I'll go." And so you end up riding on the Zephyr, and it was the scariest thing I'd ever done. Take off in the morning on your bike and go places around town, around the neighborhood, or around the city, even, and you might not come back until dark, or you'd come back for lunch and have lunch, and you'd take off again. And your mom would say, "Be in by dark," and you'd come back by dark and you'd eat supper, and then you go back out and play again in the street. You'd play hide and seek, find all kind of places to hide in the neighborhood. And you have 10, 12, 15 kids out there all playing hide and seek, see what they could find. And it was fun. It's a lot of memories. I remember riding my bike. We would go down Frenchman Street to Gentilly. You cross Gentilly, and at the corner of Gentilly and Legion Field, you had a little shopping center. But the interesting thing about that shopping center is they had a parking lot on the roof. And so we would ride our bikes up there, and the parking lot ramp came down right at Frenchman Street, just a half block from Gentilly Boulevard. And there was a traffic light at Frenchman and Gentilly. And so we would sit up at the top of the parking lot doing circles and try to time the traffic light where we could come down that ramp as fast as we could and go right through the traffic light on that main 3-lane road through there, that we would catch it green. And sometimes we had to stop pretty short when we didn't catch it green, so we wouldn't get run over. And it's amazing that none of us ever got run over crossing that light. But it was just fun as a kid. You know, you're indestructible. You can do all kinds of things. You just ride your bike as fast as you can. And that's how we could do it, coming down that ramp. We didn't have any hills. The other monkey hill child of the park. You had the Roman Candyman that would come around in his wagon through the neighborhood periodically. You could buy candy. You had Manuel's hot tamale stands around town, and they would come in just after dark and crank up their lanterns and sit there most of the night selling hot tamales. You could just pull up there on the street and buy hot tamales. I remember the Lucky Dog stands, the fruit and vegetable guy that would drive around the neighborhood, and women would come out and buy fresh fruit and vegetable off of his truck, and usually he was the farmer. I remember going to the French Quarter. I remember the thing that really sticks in my mind is my father talking about. He would go down to the French market and man the stand down there where my grandfather sold vegetables. My grandfather had another job, you know, where he was an electrician, especially after the I guess during the Depression. My grandfather worked for WPA as an electrician, and as a family business they sold fruits and vegetables at the French market. And so the kids would end up going down and man that. And my father would drive the truck down there with the vegetables every morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, and set up and be there. And I remember talking about going for lunch and getting a po' boy for 10 cents. I think a stereotype that the people of New Orleans are friendly is true, even today. But as a child, there was nothing to fear.